The final case of Gibbons versus Ogden is where the court established that the federal government regulates interstate commerce. What happens in the Gibbons decision is that you had a charter for river transport between New Jersey and New York granted to one individual. And one of these guys from the competing state sued and said, well, what if I'm from New Jersey and I want to grant that charter to go to New York? Can New York say this is the way it is for everyone on the river? And the court said no, because it involves commerce or business between states. Interstate commerce cannot be a matter of one state simply saying, this is how it's going to be for anybody who trades around this region, because the states are essentially legally equals and they can't impose their will upon other states economically, which is why the federal government exists as the regulatory agent for interstate commerce, which can make fair and impartial binding decisions for all the states. The era of good feelings, as we said, was a time when there is dispute, there is argumentation, and there is discussion. And you don't have a unanimity of American political thought. And the key element that brings this out is the gradual emergence of a word that's going to be an AP term from here out that's going to play a greater and greater and greater role, the S word, sectionalism. And this comes about with the expansion and growth of the United States. As the United States grows, this map is way ahead of where we are right now, but you'll notice a nice color combination in this map. You have pink states and green states. The green states are going to represent states that are free states, states in which slavery is illegal, whereas the pink states are going to represent states where slaveholding is basically the society's culture, the law of the land, perfectly legal and can be done. From the beginning of the Republic forward, as new states have been admitted beyond the original 13 states of the United States in the post-1783 period, Congress have been very careful to try to admit states on an even basis, almost like animals going in the ark, 2 by 2, so that you would have within the Congress an even number of slave states and free states, and an even number of slave state senators and free state senators to kind of keep this balance of power existing within the government. Pressures on movement after the War of 1812 and westward expansion start to push this system a little bit. And remember what we had talked about in some of your previous lessons and things you reviewed. One of the legacies of the War of 1812 is that serious westward movement begins without having to worry about issues from Canada anymore, or French-controlled Louisiana, or British encroachment on impressment and seizure of our trade ships and wars and all those kind of things. Americans turn their focus from a Eurocentric focus to a continental-centric focus. And you saw large-scale expansion all throughout this era. And some of the spurs, the impetus of these kind of movements, would have involved the acquisition of Native American lands. The War of 1812 finishes the process that began during the Revolutionary period of essentially cleaning out Native American resistance through the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the Battle of Thames, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. We see northern and southern Native American resistance increasingly broken, and it opens up these large tracts for white settlement. You also see economic pressures because you've got this notion of difficulties in the Northeast, the end of the war. You see people striking out to start with new opportunities on this land because they don't see their previous environments as holding a lot of economic opportunities for them. You also have improved transportation. The American system is going to start paying dividends to the nation during this time period. You start to see a canal system set up. Not a rail system yet, but improved road networks come out during this time period, which makes it easier to transport people west. The invention of the steamboat is going to come quite close into this period as well, which is going to allow for improved means of getting large numbers of people and product and goods both to the west and back in terms of their products and goods as necessary. And of course, the last one, which has been a permanent spur to westward expansion since 1607 and 1620, immigration. You're still seeing immigrants coming over from Europe, from the various nations of Northern and Western Europe during this time, and working their way over to the United States and then moving further to the unsettled areas or settling areas and then having other people move further as a result. So with this in mind, the issue to try to preserve a sectional balance between North and South gets somewhat difficult. And so as Missouri is ready to enter the Union, it's going to upset the balance between slave and free states. And there's no real line of thinking on what to do. It's unexpected to see Missouri apply for statehood in 1820. James Talmadge, a representative from New York, starts a real debate about Missouri that he didn't realize he was starting by proposing an amendment for Missouri's admission as Missouri's coming into the Union. He proposes that no further slaves be allowed into the state of Missouri other than the ones that are there now, and that all Missouri slaves should be emancipated by the age of 25. If this amendment had been adopted and pulled through, it would mean that over time, slavery would gradually go away in the state of Missouri. Even though there were slaves in 1820, it would disappear over time. It would kind of grandfather itself out. Southerners saw this as part of a massive conspiracy. They were livid and thought this was part of a massive conspiracy to start in Missouri and start picking off the rest of the southern states. If it can be done there, why don't we try to pass amendments to have that happen to all the existing states one at a time, and even further deny slavery to anywhere in the territories? So we're heading towards a showdown in this union over what to do about this slavery issue. Thomas Jefferson famously likened this to what he called the fire bell in the night. What he saw is this signal, this summons of danger and doom and bad things with Missouri and what we were to do about it. Because Jefferson was lamenting that as a nation, we hadn't yet reconciled any real answer to what to do about the slave question. As a former slave owner himself, he still had reservations about what should have been done about slavery. To resolve this issue, we enter, as a nationalist, Henry Clay, who we knew as a war hawk from the War of 1812, but is going to begin for the first time to earn his newer and more lasting nickname besides war hawk of the Great Compromiser, both of which are useful AP nickname terms to use if you write about Clay on the exam. Clay's proposals for compromise on this issue were to restore the model of pairing up states, 3 separate bills that working together became the Missouri Compromise. Part 1 of the compromise, you see Missouri's pink, admit Missouri as a slave state. Part 2, at the same time, take Maine, which had formerly been part of Massachusetts, as you'd seen in some of your earlier lessons, and admit Maine as an independent state of its own. So now you're back to 2 by 2, bringing states in, let Maine come in. And lastly, try to solve this problem for the future. He draws a magic line. There's a few magic lines that become important in American history. The Proclamation of 1763 line is one of them. We've got a few others. This is the first of the others. A line at 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude. A line right there across the map, so that we don't have this issue from here on out. And what his solution is, once we draw this line, let's say that any territories that are organized into states north of this line become free territories. Any territories that are organized into states that come into states south of this line become slave territories. That way, he says, we can have a nice, tidy solution. For the moment, it forestalls, this resolution forestalls sectional crisis, but notice how it doesn't solve the problem. It solves the problem by saying, let's just not talk about it anymore, but it doesn't solve the problem of should we have slavery in the country or not. But it does, for 30 years, provide the basis for a solid balance between North and South to not have to argue over the slavery issues, at least in regard to westward expansion. The 3630 line will sweep this issue under the rug as, in a similar way, the Constitutional Convention saying in 20 years, in 1808, we'll ban the slave trade, swept it under the rug and kicked it down the road. But the slavery issue, as you're well aware from all of your coursework so far, is not an issue that's simply going to be that easy to dispense with. And our review cycles for many future lessons will get more involved into that issue as we go through it. But for now, with Chapter 14, you're seeing this era of good feelings, as it's so called, doesn't always have good feelings. And in Lesson 15, our next lesson, we'll see the era of good feelings sort of morph into what you're really seeing. We're not going to call it good feelings anymore. We're going to move beyond that into economic development and growth and increased sectionalism and regionalism as a result, because it's hard to keep everybody on the same page in a free democratic republic. But those are lessons for future times.